Stacey, you're still muted.
Okay, I said good evening. What I wanted to say was what I had said, and I thought you guys were hearing me, is that chapter 16, chapter 16 really had so much information. So if you don't have a chance to pick up any other chapter, moving through those 3 chapters, I would challenge you to read chapter 16, which is protective fiber. And thank you, Moselle, for those sweet words. And thank you again for this challenge, because it's definitely a challenge that you put before me. And thankfully, I've been able to accept. Because each
Yes,
week,
thankfully.
it was harder in the beginning, and then it got easier, but then it got a little bit harder. But I look forward to reading these chapters. So I really do appreciate this challenge that you put before me. So if I mispronounce a word, just know that I'm not science-based as Moselle and the others are, but I'll do my best. So at the beginning of this chapter, Fung, and the book, of course, is the Obesity Code for those that may have just joined, by Dr. Fung. Let's see, I guess it doesn't show up, but anyway. In the beginning of the chapter, he poses the question, debates occurred in the past, were carbs good or were they bad? And so during the 1950s and from the 1950s to the 1990s, they were considered good. So they were low in fat, but they considered to be the end to all, and they combated the epidemic of heart disease. So thanks to Atkins, Fung noted in his book, in the late 1990s, the recasting of carbs and the role of dietary, that the role of carbs was labeled as a dietary villain. And most advocates avoided all carbs back then, including fruits and vegetables. So the question again was, are carbs good or bad? So with Fung, he pointed out that first insulin and insulin resistance drives obesity. And this is white sugar, white flour, which causes the greatest increase in insulin levels. So we've accepted that good carbs are whole fruits and vegetables, that they are different from bad carbs, which are considered sugar and flour. And he noted here that broccoli, no matter how much you eat, is not likely to make you fat. So you can eat as much of that as you want. And Moselle has talked to us many times about these green vegetables being very good for us, and we can continue to eat as much as we want. And he says that although consuming even modest amounts of sugar can cause, he says even consuming a modest amount of sugar can cause weight gain. So you can't just do sugar in moderation. So he says, yes, both are carbs. So this chapter started explaining to us about what glycemic index and the glycemic load was. And so I'd never heard of these terms. I've heard of, glycemic, but I'd never heard of what those particular terms meant. And so he went on to say that Dr. David Jenkins of the University of Toronto began to address the problems in 1981 with the glycemic index. And that's where foods were ranked. And I think all that information that Moselle and Katrina have sent to us, it's really good to be able to see how that correlates and read the material. And that's why you're able to understand about how some of these fruits and vegetables are ranked higher on the scale. So he said that these foods were ranked in according to their ability to raise glucose levels. And this is looking at, this is of course looking at how much glycemity or their glycemic, I guess, stage on the index. And so he says that dietary protein and fat did not raise blood glucose. So these were excluded from the glycemic index that measured only carbs containing food. He noted that foods in the glycemic index were insulin, and they stimulated in that those stimulated the effect that were closely correlated. And so he was looking at how these cause, obesity. So then he looked at also, he says, so then he gave this example, which I think is really good and we can all kind of relate to. He says, if you take a carrot, a watermelon, apples, bread, candy bar, oatmeal, and you can measure out 50 grams of that, he says that is what he started kind of measuring to see the effect on blood glucose. And then he compared those things and he assigned them all with up to numbers valued of 100. So then there was the index. But then if you notice on your food packaging, they always say like serving size. So then he started talking about what's the glycemic load. And so he pointed out that watermelon could have a very low glycemic load, which could be 5. And then you could have tortilla, which could be considered, which is, tortilla, which could be considered a high ranking of 25. So, and that all can be found on page 176 and 177. So, so that was really interesting because, he was just showing us how a lot of people look at just calories, but when you look at how they affect how they affect sugar, what sugar's in them and how they affect us, how they affect our bodies, then you can look at them from that standpoint. And he says that Western refined foods have a very high glycemic index and glycemic load scores. And traditionally, whole foods, which we just mentioned earlier, have low scores. So even though they contain similar amounts of carbs, carbs are not inherently fattening, but most important, their toxicity lies in the way that they're processed. And again, Moselle has talked to us about how more in the Western world, we have now modernized the way we produce our foods and also industrialized it. And so, they in the way they're processed. So now, more in the industrialized world, we're refining them different. And so he says that refining significantly increases glycemic index by purifying and concentrating the carbs. The removal of the fat, the fiber, and protein means that the carb can be digested and absorbed very quickly. And so he says, example of this is like wheat. When they were milling it, they would milling in the old terms, they would do a traditional stone milling. But now they use this term pulverize, which they make the flour, they do it in a very fine manner. And then that's how we get flour. So it's all in the process. So what I've learned in this chapter, and a lot of this, is that food is not inherently bad for us. It's really just how it's the manner of how it's transferred to us and how we receive it. And that's why when we wonder back in the day, why we're starting to see so many diseases, it's because of all this modernization along, that has, transpired. And so that's how we've gotten here. And he gave this other example, which is really interesting for all of us to note. And we all, pretty much know this. He was making a note that with orange juice, you can drink a glass of orange juice, but it takes 4 to 5 oranges to make that glass, right? So he's saying that if we were to just eat an orange ourselves, we probably wouldn't even eat 4 to 5 orange juices. So there's something to be said that if we eat foods like Moselle has pointed out whole, then we would not overeat. And so that's why they say that, we've made things too easy for us. And so that's how you have overconsumption. So, so it's not that, having oranges are bad for you, but it's that when it's processed and it's not fresh, then, then we do tend to overconsume and have more than a serving than we should of orange juice. And then he points out the same thing about he says that we have had to eat all our fiber and same thing with apples and grains and veggies. We don't eat them the traditional way, eating them as a whole product or whatever. We're eating them processed. And so we don't have to think twice about it. So then we can overeat in those areas. So he pointed out that the key problem is balance. And he says that our bodies have adapted to the balance of nutrients in whole food, but by refining foods, but by consuming refined foods, the balance is destroyed. So he says that people have been eating unrefined carbs for thousands of years without obesity and diabetes. So, what's changed and recently what's changed, he says we now predominantly eat refined grains as our carb of choice. And he moved on in that chapter and started talking about vinegar. And I've, known how, vinegar has been really good for us, but, they point out how, vinegar is mainly, vinegar is really wine that that if you leave it, it's, well, first of all, the Latin word of it is sour wine, and he says if we leave it alone undisturbed, it eventually turns back to vinegar. And he says that ancient people quickly discovered vinegar's versatility, and vinegar is even now widely spread used, and it's used as a cleaning substance. It can be used for pickling. Distilled vinegar has been known as a weight loss. That's one of the other uses. And but he says also that blood glucose does not drive weight gain, and that's another highlight that I picked up. So I went on to chapter 17, and 17 was protein. And there they just talked about carbs, reducing diets are nutritionally unbalanced, and natural foods contain significant amounts of saturated fats. And so basically, if we eat our natural foods, then we eat the right amount of fats, and we eat the right amount, we eat what's really needed for our bodies. It's just that when we eat more refined foods and processed foods, then we're consuming more, and what our body's not used to. So chapter 16 was really, really good. And so chapter 18, since I spent so much time on chapter 16, because I really thought it really needed a lot more attention. And not saying that the others weren't well, but chapter 18, let's see, yeah, chapter 18, I think it's, I'm getting a little, let's see, yeah, 18, eat phobia. This is where they pointed out the doctor introduced the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet was discovered. Let's see, this was discovered, and in this chapter, Dr. Jenkins, he had witnessed the diet when he visited a country. And so what he started looking at, he came back and he created his own study that was widely known, and he mainly started looking at I'm sorry, I apologize. That wasn't him. It was Dr. Keyes. He created the 7 country study, and with this study, he came up with some advice, which is pretty interesting. Some advice that he says on how to prevent the cardiovascular disease, and that's what they were really pretty much focused on, in the 1950s and 60s. And so what he said was clearly, just don't get fat. And he says that if you do get fat, reduce it quickly. And he says that restrict saturated fats in beef, pork, lamb. And then he also said prefer vegetable oils to solid fats. And you can look at that, and we've come a long way, from now they're saying, just prefer those fats. And so we've come a long way. And so then the study concluded saying cholesterol levels predicted heart disease risk, and the amount of saturated fat in the diet predicted cholesterol levels. And then he said that the Mediterranean diet protected against heart disease, and monosaturated fat protected against heart disease. And so what I like about this chapter is it broke down telling you about the heart disease. It explained just really what a lot of us already know, that the way that the arteries become damaged and narrowed and hardened is because of the buildup of plaque. Then he also goes on to say how a blood clot happens. And so I was, I'd heard these things, but just revisiting this stuff again, like Moselle, has pointed out several times, it just makes you really think about when you hear people having blood clots, what really happens. And so I didn't really realize that the plaque ruptures. And so when the plaque ruptures, then there's a blood clot that's formed, and then that eventually can block the artery, resulting in a lack of oxygen that can cause a heart attack, and so on. And so I like clearly how he describes all of these different diseases and the actions that happen with it. And then he talks about how, we don't study more and know more about the liver. And he says that that if our body does not have, if we reduce our body from cholesterol, and that's one of the key things, and I didn't really realize this, is that we look at reducing our cholesterol, but he says that we cannot just not have cholesterol in our diet, because if we do, our body will definitely try to form its own, and it will make it, not even know our bodies made cholesterol. But that was one of the things, and he says that we do need cholesterol because is the key building block in the membrane that surrounds all the cells in the body. And if you reduce cholesterol in your diet, your body will simply make more. And so he says it's vital that every cell in the body, except for the brain, I mean, it's vital that we have it. And he says that every cell in our body, except for the brain, has the ability to make it. And I didn't have any idea about that. So I will say that these three chapters are really, really good chapters and I will say that if you do anything, I would definitely read the 16th chapter, but the last chapter 18 says that diets high in fat do not account for the high prevalence of excess body fat in Western countries. It also points out that the reduction of percentage of energy from fat will be more important, will have no important benefits, but it does exacerbate this problem. So the emphasis on total weight reduction has been serious distraction in the efforts to control obesity. So just trying to reduce fat and not focusing on your diet and what you're consuming and where it comes from is not enough. And that's why this whole thing that we're learning and learn the background is really good, because we're learning that all these things are good toward attacking obesity, but you've got to put it in the right frame and understand why you're doing what you're doing and why you're consuming what you're.
It's amazing, as a layperson, you're able to. Let's give her. First of all, let's give her a hand, everybody.
Thank you.
And she's a layperson. She doesn't necessarily have a chemistry or a biology